Why was a king kept hidden from his own people and feared by the very doctors assigned to keep him alive? Charles II of Spain was born a monarch, but many said he should never have lived at all. His jaw couldn't close, his skin was paper thin, his tongue was too large to speak clearly. Some said he was cursed. Others believed he was the result of sin, the physical punishment for a dynasty's crimes. Yet, despite all this, the church called him divinely chosen, and the people were told to worship him as a gift from God. But behind closed doors, the truth was far more disturbing. This story is reconstructed from sealed medical reports, letters written by terrified royal physicians, and eyewitness accounts hidden for centuries in the Archivo General de Simancas. Some of these documents, once deemed too sensitive for the public, describe a man whose body was so malformed and whose health so fragile that multiple officials questioned whether he was human at all. One surgeon even refused to touch him, writing, "His body does not obey the laws of life." If you watch this video until the end, you'll uncover the horrifying truth about Charles II's inbreeding, and what it did to his body, why the church declared him sacred, while his doctors called him the child of death, what his secret autopsy revealed, and why it was hidden for over 100 years. This is not the version of Charles II you'll read in textbooks. This is the forbidden file, the classified case of a king who was worshipped and feared as a monster. Part 1. Born of blood. The genetic curse of the Habsburgs, the royal birth of Charles II, was meant to secure the future of the Spanish Empire. Instead, it marked the beginning of its most grotesque chapter. Born on November 6, 1661, Charles came into the world under flickering candlelight and silence. No public cheers, no ringing bells, only the pale, stiff faces of midwives and physicians who, as one anonymous servant later wrote, stared not at a child, but at a prophecy. His head was large and misshapen. His jaw jutted forward unnaturally. His speech was described as barely intelligible to any but his nurse. His limbs were frail and uncoordinated. He didn't cry. One physician reportedly crossed himself 3 times and whispered, "Another error of blood." The deformities seen in Charles II were not isolated. The Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, had been growing more severe with each generation of the royal family. Charles II's pedigree collapse was nearly total. His father was also his mother's uncle, and over 80% of his ancestors descended from the same for bloodlines. But with Charles, it reached its breaking point. He couldn't chew food properly. His tongue was so large, and his mouth so misaligned that he drooled constantly and struggled to form words. Others point to a long line of royal children who died in infancy, were born with deformities, or vanished from records entirely. Historians often chalk this up to centuries of inbreeding, and they're not wrong. An academic study published in Nature 2009 analyzed 3,000 family connections within the Habsburg lineage. Some geneticists estimate that Charles had less genetic variation than a child born of sibling incest. What's disturbing is that the Habsburg court knew something was wrong before Charles was even born. Hidden in the archives of the Escorial Monastery is a letter written by Queen Mariana of Austria, Charles' mother, weeks before the birth. If God sees fit to deliver this child into the world, I pray his mercy extends beyond the curse that shadows our line. What curse? What shadow? Many believe she referred to Don Carlos, the mentally unstable son of Philip II, who died under mysterious circumstances. Others point to a long line of royal children who died in infancy, were born with deformities, or vanished from records entirely, though never admitted publicly. Members of the royal council suspected the bloodline was poisoned, but were too politically entangled to change course. The Spanish Empire needed an heir, no matter the cost, and the cost was Charles. By age 3, Charles II had yet to walk. His limbs were weak, and his bones fragile. One physician, Dr. Juan de Herrera, noted that his legs bent like candle wax near flame. The royal household believed that exposing him to holy items would heal his body. Instead of seeing doctors, he was surrounded by priests and relics. But Charles didn't get better. In fact, his health worsened every winter, with long periods of unexplained fever, seizures, and bleeding gums. At age 5, he suffered what was described as a paralytic episode that left him bedridden for nearly a year. Still, the public was told nothing. Paintings of the young prince, carefully staged, show a rosy-cheeked boy with regal poise. What they don't show is the wicker, chair hidden behind him, supporting a body that could barely stand. But here's the paradox. As Charles's deformities became more obvious, so did the public adoration. Why? Because the church began to reinterpret his suffering as divine. According to several sermons preserved in the Collection de Discursos Reals, bishops declared Charles II a living martyr, proof that God had chosen Spain to suffer for the sins of the Reformation, the Turks, and the Jews. He was not broken, he was sacrificial. This belief helped preserve the monarchy's image. But it did something more insidious. It justified his pain. He was a symbol. A sick king was no longer a scandal. But those who lived inside the palace, the nurses, the physicians, the servants, saw something different. A child who cried without making a sound. Who was afraid of mirrors? Who would stare at a candle for hours without blinking? And then came the rumors that Charles II was not fully human, that he had been born without a soul, that his body was host to something dark. One Jesuit, later exiled for heresy, wrote in a private letter, "If he was born of sin, then it walks with him still." But how did Charles survive into adulthood? How did a child who could not speak clearly or eat without help become a crowned king? That's where the manipulation began. And it only gets darker from here. He couldn't speak clearly. He couldn't even feed himself without assistance. Part 2. A puppet crowned. The monstrous reign behind the curtain. Charles II was crowned King of Spain in 1665. He was only 3 years old. He couldn't read. At age 9, he still needed help dressing himself. His tutors reported frequent blackouts, extended staring spells, and moments where he'd mutter to himself in Latin and Castilian fragments. That didn't make sense. And yet, across Spain and its vast empire, bells rang out and priests declared, the hand of God has placed his chosen on the throne. But inside the palace walls, the horror was just beginning. But according to many reports, she was less a mother and more a caretaker under siege. For the first years of his reign, real power lay with his mother, Queen Mariana of Austria, acting as regent. Why? Because no one really knew what Charles would become. He could barely walk unassisted until age 5. A now declassified report from Don Francisco de Ayala, a court secretary, described Charles as a boy who smiles at walls, fears mirrors, and repeats the Lord's Prayer backward in his sleep. Whether Charles was mentally disabled, epileptic, schizophrenic, or something else remains a matter of fierce debate. No formal diagnosis was ever made. But what terrified the court was not only his instability, it was how obsessively he clung to rituals. He insisted on being blessed 21 times a day, lighting candles in precise numbers, depending on the color of his food, whispering Ave Maria over his drink before swallowing, even if it was just water. When court officials tried to limit these behaviors, Charles would reportedly shake uncontrollably and scream until his nose bled. According to some whispers in the palace, his mind was guarded by something not of this world. But instead of treating him, they cloaked it in faith. The Inquisition declared him touched by divine frailty, and any servant who hinted at illness risked accusation of heresy. By the time Charles reached adulthood, physically, if not mentally, Spain was falling apart. The economy was collapsing. War debts piled up. Pirates raided trade routes. Famine struck provinces. Revolts threatened to rip apart the empire. But Charles didn't understand any of it. According to the private writings of court tutor Don Ignacio Rodriguez, Charles would ask, "Some treated him like a god. Others treated him like a weapon. If the bread is missing, why do we not bake more?" He had no concept of money or of governance. He was still, at heart, a child with a crown. That left a dangerous vacuum, and it was filled by advisers, clergy, and nobles, all vying to control him. And in the shadows, something else was growing: superstition. Because the longer Charles lived, the more people whispered that his survival was unnatural. In 1679, Charles II was married to Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess. Some said Charles didn't know how to consummate a marriage. Others believed his body couldn't survive the strain. She was beautiful, educated, and healthy. He was 18 years old, but by many accounts, barely understood what a marriage was. The couple never had children. Rumors swirled: impotence, sterility, curses. A midwife's unsent letter, found years later in an unopened royal pouch, described Marie-Louise crying during their wedding night, saying, "He lies beside me like a frightened animal. His breath is thick. His eyes do not close." Marie-Louise died at age 26. Officially, stomach cancer. Unofficially, whispers of poison. Others claimed she died of grief. When Charles was told of her death, he locked himself in his room for 3 days, not out of mourning, but because he believed her spirit was trapped inside his walls. He ordered all mirrors removed from the palace. By 1690, Charles's health was failing rapidly. He suffered from severe weight loss, partial blindness, memory lapses, occasional bleeding from his eyes and ears, and inability to digest most solid food. Fearing scandal and collapse, the Crown established a secret medical council, a group of doctors, priests, and political advisors tasked with keeping Charles alive at any cost. Their records, buried in the Simancas archive until 1947, reveal a disturbing pattern. His Majesty's body is shrinking. His hair falls in clumps. His urine is black. He sleeps with his eyes open. One Italian doctor wrote, "He has the body of a man aged 90 and the soul of a terrified child." What they didn't include in the official reports, but referenced in letters, were the night screams. Charles, they said, would wake up screaming the name of his dead wife, or mutter incoherent prayers, or beg the shadows to leave. And yet, he refused to die. Priests called it a miracle. Doctors called it an abomination. Some wondered, was he being kept alive by faith or by something darker? In 1698, desperate for answers, Charles II was subjected to a secret exorcism, not officially sanctioned, but approved behind closed doors by high-ranking members of the church. According to the diary of Father Froilan Diaz, the priest who conducted the rite, Charles displayed no supernatural resistance, but did something far more disturbing. He replied, "The thing that's been hiding in me is quieter now." He wept like a child and whispered thank you after each verse. He seemed relieved. But when I asked what he felt, he replied, "The thing that's been hiding in me is quieter now." What thing? Was this a metaphor for illness? A confession of madness? Or something else? The Vatican never acknowledged the exorcism, but Charles's condition continued to worsen, and he would not live to see the end of the century. His death would be as strange as his life, and his autopsy would reveal the final horror. Part 3, The King's Last Breath, Death, Autopsy, and the Forbidden Report. By the turn of the century, Spain was barely functioning. Its empire fractured, its economy in collapse, and its king rotting alive. Charles II, now 38 years old, could no longer walk unassisted. He had no children, no heir, no voice in court. His skin was translucent, his teeth blackened, his hair thin and falling. He weighed less than 45 kilograms, a frail shadow of monarchy. Yet still, he ruled, still. Priests lit candles in his name, still. Dignitaries bowed before a man who, by all accounts, should have died a decade earlier. But his final days would deliver one of the most horrifying royal autopsies in European history. The year was 1700. The Spanish court had grown silent, almost funereal. Nobles avoided the palace unless summoned. Foreign ambassadors filed reports not about Spain's policy, but about the king's smell. Yes, smell. One diplomat from Genoa wrote that when he speaks, something of the grave escapes. It is said that the king's body leaks, that his breath fouls the air. Servants worked in rotating shifts, never staying longer than 30 minutes in his presence. No windows were opened. No reports acknowledged his state. The illusion of monarchy had to be preserved. The king's death would mean a succession crisis, and France and Austria were prepared to tear Europe apart over it. But behind the scenes, ministers were already planning for war. All they needed was for Charles to die. He wouldn't. He lingered, bedridden, racked with seizures, sudden blindness, hallucinations, and chronic diarrhea. He reportedly told a confessor, "I hear wings at night. I think the angels are afraid to take me." On the night of November 1st, 1700, Charles's breathing slowed. Witnesses said he stared at the ceiling for hours, unmoving, lips trembling. One servant swore that as midnight approached, Charles whispered, "I go to be judged, but I know not by whom." At 12:15 a.m., the King of Spain died, alone save for a confessor and a terrified boy servant who reportedly vomited upon seeing his face. The body was sealed in his chambers until the next morning. Then came the autopsy, performed by royal physicians under armed guard. No records were to be published, but someone took notes. A single surviving copy of the autopsy, smuggled out by a German ambassador and archived in Vienna, reads like something out of a horror novel. The highlights: his heart was the size of a walnut. His lungs were corroded and black. His intestines rotted and gas-filled. He had only a single testicle, black as coal. His skull contained no blood and barely any brain matter of substance. His stomach was a pool of dark liquid. His body was infested with intestinal worms and evidence of chronic renal failure. One physician reportedly cried out, "This man has been dead for years," and did not know it. Another asked, "How did he live this long? By what force was he held together?" The answer, no one could say. Despite the grotesque state of his body, the church insisted Charles II receive a state burial. He was dressed in fine garments, crowned, paraded, praised. Thousands gathered to witness the procession. No one saw the body, but many smelled it. The streets of Madrid were filled with a stench that lingered for days. Later, it was revealed that his coffin leaked, and lime had to be added twice to prevent further decay during the funeral rites. And then, silence. The lid closed, the tomb sealed. The last Habsburg was gone. And yet, the question remains, was Charles II a monster, a product of cruel breeding, superstition, and the relentless machinery of empire? Or was he a martyr, a man born broken, manipulated and worshipped, abused and idolized, simply to delay the fall of a dying world? Historians still debate this. Some say he was a tragic figure. Others say he was the inevitable result of dynastic hubris. But others, the few who read the hidden reports, who traced the church's silence, who examined the things whispered by servants and scribes, say he was not a king. He was a body kept alive to protect the illusion of power. To this day, the Escorial crypt holds his remains. Visitors walk past his tomb, unaware of what lies within. There is no special monument, no warning, no truth carved in stone, just a name, and a story most still do not dare to tell. But if the empire died with him, perhaps he was not its last king. Perhaps he was its ghost. Part 4, Echoes in the Blood. Was Charles II cursed? If Charles II's body was horrifying, his legacy may be even more disturbing. Because after his death, a new story began to spread, not one of medical failure, but spiritual corruption. That Charles II was not merely sick, nor merely mad. He was cursed. But who, or what, could curse a king? To answer that, we must follow the bloodline into war. Witchcraft, and one of the most whispered rumors in all of Europe. We already know that Charles II was the product of extreme inbreeding. But what is often missed is this. The Habsburgs believed that purity of blood equaled divine right to rule. It wasn't just tradition, it was dogma. This meant that incestuous marriages were arranged not in spite of health risks, but because of them. To dilute the bloodline would be to weaken God's chosen family. In other words, Charles was born sick because they thought sickness proved holiness. Let that sink in. Modern geneticists reviewing his ancestry estimate Charles had a level of inbreeding higher than a child born of sibling incest. Among his 16 great-great-grandparents, only two were unique individuals. His twisted jaw, his underdeveloped organs, his mental frailty, all likely stem from this decision to marry cousin after cousin, uncle after niece, across 16 generations. But not everyone in the 17th century thought genetics were to blame. Some believed his condition came from the devil. According to a secret report compiled by Inquisitor Fray Moro Tovar in 1699, there was a growing belief among church officials that Charles II had been bewitched. The report, buried for over a century, contains disturbing claims that his semen contained no generative life, that he was the victim of an occult blinding at birth, that his soul had been traded before he was conceived, and the culprit, a powerful noble family, unnamed, suspected of employing Moorish mystics and Jewish healers, both illegal under Spanish law. The Inquisition took this seriously. They launched an internal investigation, raided several estates, and tortured spiritualists to confess to the king's bewitchment. No hard evidence was found, but the suspicion never died. Charles himself began to believe it. In the last 2 years of his life, Charles II became obsessed with the idea that he had been cursed in the womb. He demanded that priests read every exorcism ritual known to the church. He ordered bones of saints brought into his chamber. He even had holy water poured into his food, to ensure no evil could enter through nourishment. In a letter to Pope Innocent XII, never officially acknowledged, Charles reportedly wrote, "If I am the work of man, then man has failed. If I am the work of Satan, may God be my physician." His final confessor, Father Gregorio di Vega, recorded chilling sessions in his journal. He said something was inside, chewing his heart. He thought it had wings. He begged me to cut open his chest. Was this madness? A desperate metaphor? Or was Charles simply articulating what everyone around him had long feared, that something unnatural had been passed through his bloodline? After Charles died and the Spanish Habsburg line ended, Europe was plunged into the War of Spanish Succession, a bloody, decades-long conflict over who should inherit the throne. Spain was torn apart. Cities burned. Thousands died. Some saw this not just as political fallout, but as spiritual reckoning. In folk belief across Iberia, a legend took hold that the sins of the Habsburgs had summoned a generational curse, a curse that culminated in Charles, the Shadow King, and then ripped the empire apart. Local priests warned of signs. Children born with black eyes, mirrors that cracked without cause. Candles that would not light in noble houses. It sounds absurd now. But at the time, these fears were real enough to shape public behavior. In fact, for the next half-century, no Spanish monarch dared to have their child baptized in El Escorial, the very place Charles had died. One noblewoman, writing in 1720, said, "The stench of him still clings to the stone. We bury kings there, but never innocents." So let's ask again, was Charles II cursed? Not by witches, perhaps. Not by demons or devils, but by history, by belief, by arrogance. Only a body to sit upon a throne, no matter how rotten that body became. He was a boy made into a symbol, his suffering weaponized, his pain misinterpreted as sanctity. He was not allowed to be a person, only a king. Whether by blood, belief, or both, Charles was doomed before he drew his first breath. Even today, when scholars read his autopsy or trace the lineage that produced him, they speak with a quiet reverence, as if acknowledging something terribly wrong, too monstrous for casual discussion. Because Charles II was not just the last of his line, he was the price of a dynasty's pride. And some say his story is not a lesson, but a warning. Part 5. The Broken Throne. How Charles II's death changed Europe forever. When Charles II finally died in 1700, he took more than a last breath. He took with him an entire world order. For over 200 years, the Habsburgs had ruled Spain and its vast overseas empire. But now, with no heir, no strength, and no unity, the vacuum left behind by Charles's rotting throne became the most violent inheritance in European history. His death ignited a firestorm that changed the course of nations. This is what happened next. Charles II named Philip of Anjou, grandson of King Louis XIV of France, as his successor. The French were delighted, but the Austrians, English, Dutch, and many Spaniards were horrified. If France gained control of Spain and its empire in the Americas, Asia, and Europe, no single power could challenge them. And so began the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal 10-year conflict from 1701 to 1714 that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. Armies marched through Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries. Villages were razed. Children were conscripted. Even the Pope had to navigate the treacherous politics of a war over a dead king with no legacy but disease. It was, by all accounts, a war caused by rot. Spain, already weakened by famine, bankruptcy, and incompetent governance, fractured under the pressure of war. The once mighty fleets that had ruled the Atlantic were now rusted and scattered. Colonies revolted, smugglers outnumbered loyal merchants, and in key territories like Naples, Sardinia, and the Spanish Netherlands, support for the new monarch wavered. Why? Because many believed Charles II's curse had not ended, only changed shape. One soldier in Catalonia wrote in a battlefield diary, "We do not fight for Spain. We fight against ghosts." Another Catholic bishop in Seville declared, "Until the last breath of the Habsburg king is exorcised from our land, God will withhold his favor." Whether real or symbolic, Charles's legacy haunted the battlefield. Charles was buried in the pantheon of kings at El Escorial, the dark granite monastery that housed centuries of Spanish royalty. But something strange occurred. 4 years after his burial, his tomb was left unmarked. There was no grand epitaph, no marble relief, no national day of mourning. It's as if Spain wanted to forget him. But the rumors persisted. Servants claimed to hear scratching from within the tomb. Visitors reported a foul smell. Even decades later, one French ambassador refused to enter the crypt, writing, "The air in that place is unnatural. It makes the lungs shrink." And so the royal mausoleum, once a symbol of Catholic triumph, became a whispered symbol of decay. Even today, some visitors report cold spots around Charles II's tomb. Others say the room feels heavier near his resting place. Is it guilt, suggestion, or something else? But perhaps the most lasting impact wasn't political or spiritual. It was psychological. Charles II's grotesque decline forced European rulers to confront a truth they had long avoided. That power, inherited blindly, becomes madness. That belief in divine right is no match for hereditary disease, isolation, and denial. In the years that followed, monarchies across Europe began to quietly end cousin marriages. They introduced medical reviews of royal children. Some courts even hired private scientists to map bloodlines for signs of genetic weakness, not because of science, because of fear. Charles II had become a myth, a bogeyman, proof that thrones could rot just like flesh. So who was Charles II? A malformed boy, a blameless victim, a cursed king, or perhaps he was something far more dangerous, a mirror held up to power, showing what happens when legacy outweighs wisdom, when image replaces care, when blood becomes law. And in that mirror, every monarch saw the same thing, not just Charles's face, but their own. One day, because in the end, he was not a monster, he was a man who suffered because others believed. He had to rule, no matter the cost, and that belief almost destroyed a continent. Today, tourists walk through the halls of El Escorial. Most never stop at his tomb. Most never ask why the last Habsburg of Spain left behind no heir, no peace, and no legacy of joy. But if they listen carefully, if they look long enough into that cold slab of stone, they might realize some kings are remembered not for what they built, but for what they became. And Charles II became a whisper, a warning, and a ghost that Europe still hasn't entirely buried. So now you've met him. Not just a king, but a body made into a symbol. Not just a ruler, but a prisoner of history, medicine, myth, and fear. Charles II of Spain wasn't remembered for conquest, or brilliance, or glory. He was remembered because he wasn't supposed to exist, and somehow he did. You've seen the records. The blackened organs, the sealed autopsy, the obsession with exorcisms, the belief, shared by peasants and priests alike, that this king was not entirely of this world. And still, he was worshipped. Still, he was feared. Still, his death shattered empires. That's the tragedy of Charles II, a man broken from birth, used by history, and buried in silence. Not because he was evil, but because he was made to carry the sins of centuries in his body, in his blood, and in his crown. If this fascinated you, you're not alone. This was part of our Weird and Forgotten History series. Stories of kings, queens, and people just like you who lived through secrets, curses, and consequences hidden from the textbooks. Subscribe if you want to see what else history tried to bury. Like the video if you learned something new. And tell us in the comments, or just a victim of ruthless power? Was Charles II cursed, but didn't realize it until she was already bleeding to death? Because next time, we're going even deeper to the bizarre life and suspicious death of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, the queen who was stabbed by a madman. If you thought this story was strange, just wait. Until then, remember, some kings build monuments, some build legacies, but a few just leave behind questions.